but the other, we have the other aspect.
Uh-oh.
I think the Wi-Fi happenstance she was speaking about happened.
Yes.
Yeah,
We'll
students, all the
Uh-oh.
students came in.
Students came in. Yeah.
we'll give her a second, see if she comes back.
Mhm.
So for us, it's 9 a.m. So yeah, it's probably the all the students. I unplug myself from my dock, so that sometimes helps, and I'm just on Wi-Fi. But yeah, I think just following up from we were having a bit of a conversation earlier before folks got here just on as a librarian, kind of the complexity of the world, especially when we are working here within Huihua compared to our colleagues at other branches, is we're often balancing the needs of different individuals. So, for example, faculty, staff, students often are like, we want access to these items, to these print materials, to these data sets for our research. And it's important to their research for them to be able to access it. But then we have, on the other hand, communities when they come to us, which has happened very recently, even within the last month, where communities go, um, why do you have this item? This isn't meant to be shared. This will never, we need this to be returned. Or in some cases, communities don't have the capacity of us for us to return their cultural heritage because they don't have libraries in communities, they don't have archives, things like that. So they ask us to steward it. So it's this balance that we have to take. So at Huihua, we do have items that we store for communities in our special collection and archive, which are locked. And they have an item record within our library, but it's in dark. So
Mhm.
no one can see it. And some of them, they do have a public item record, but those item records are specifically say in the note that, and in the mark fields as well, that they're only accessible to like Musqueam community members. And there's a protocol around accessing them. So it's the same kind of within our digital spheres too. So it's not just within our print materials. It's the same with, we use Borealis as our data management repository, which is housed on a Canadian server, but it also is the data repository for many large academic institutions here in Canada. And we're just now being able to mitigate access to data sets and research.
Mhm.
So it is something that when it comes to the protection of Indigenous knowledges and kind of the sharing and ownership of it within a Canadian context, and I feel like from talking to my colleagues in the States as well, it's a concern in some institutions in the States, um, that it's becoming more and more prevalent. And I feel like we're having to address these issues at more of a rapid rate and having to do considerations in our in our hosting, in our OERs, in our different platforms a lot differently than we did even when I first came into academia in 2020. In 2012 is when I started as an undergraduate student. So within like this almost 15-year of academic journey, it's a growing concern and climate, and it just pops up in different areas of practice as well. So yeah, so for this session, I just thought what we could talk about in kind of this follow-up is I talked a lot about kind of the principles around sharing information, the protocols and practices, but I wanted to show some tools and also acknowledge some of the organizations that are doing this work. Because I know a lot of folks will go on to probably work with communities to develop data protocols, practices, OERs with communities as well. But there definitely are different groups and institutions that are kind of setting up ethical data frameworks, are setting up considerations, traditional knowledge labels, licenses that can be used in digital platforms. So I wanted to show some of that to folks, as well as take some questions from individuals so that we can also kind of work this out together. Because as I said, this is like very new for a lot of folks and a lot of communities as well. This is new for them. So I think that a lot of support and conversation needs to happen around it. So I'll just share my screen. Perfect. Okay, so the first thing, I did not want to show you my calendar, which will mostly just say that I'm going to Hobie all day today. But the first kind of organization that I wanted to talk about was GITA. And I don't know if folks are familiar with GITA and the work that they do, but GITA is the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. So I was kind of alluding to that a lot of the work is either happening locally, nationally, or internationally when it comes to protections around Indigenous data, Indigenous cultural heritage. What I try and do is really promote from the local, as often we are working within a localized context within communities when we're creating OERs, but that's not necessarily the case. So sometimes we can look towards international organizations that are bringing in perspectives from many different communities and that are also working with communities on different projects, different levels, and that these communities all have their own data protocols from different areas. So GITA is the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and what they do is promote Indigenous control of data. And so this also translates into information that we might put into OERs or just how we're sharing knowledges. So as I said, it's an international network. So we do have folks from Canada sitting on it, the United States, as well as Aotearoa. So I would actually say that in Aotearoa or New Zealand, there is a lot of work being done when it comes to data sovereignty and Indigenous knowledge sovereignty within that sphere, and a lot within those biocultural resources. And Maui Hudson is one of the individuals who's doing a lot of the work to kind of forward the research and the advocacy around the protection of biocultural items. One thing that GITA does is that they have the fair care principles. So I'm just going to try and find them if I can. Let's see. So fair care are data kind of principles that we can use when looking at open access, so taking the FAIR principles, as well as thinking about how we act better. So FAIR care stands for FAIR is the findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. So FAIR, and then we also have CARE. So CARE stands for collective benefit, authoritative control, responsibility, and ethics. So they are a way of governing data. So we can look at them and there's information and you can see all the individuals. There's a great paper here that's been written on fair care principles. But one thing that I want to eventually look at is how can we take fair care and incorporate fair care into things like OERs, into content management systems, and make it so that, you know, what can be shared and what cannot be shared is not shared. So fair care is definitely something that we can use when we're looking at OERs or CMSs or sharing information on that global context. Another, and so this is very Canadian focused, the OCAP principles, but I definitely think that OCAP can kind of ground some principles when individuals are working with communities that are within the United States as well. And so OCAP is the First Nations principles of OCAP. So as I was saying, within the Canadian context, we have First Nations, Métis, Inuit. And so we have First Nations all across Canada from east to west, north to south. All of these communities are different, just like Native Americans are all different from north, south, east, west in the United States, with many different languages, lived realities, and worldviews, customs, governance systems, things like that. Same with Métis as well. Métis, we have our own culture, our own governance systems, our own languages, and Inuit as well. So we all differ across what's now known as Canada. So the First Nations principles of OCAP, however, are specifically for First Nations individuals. There are also the principles of handling Métis data and Inuit data as well. So all the three different groups have their own kind of principles that align with our own protocols and practices. So OCAP principles are, they stand for ownership, control, access, and possession. So OCAP. And it's a way that First Nations have control over data collection and processes, who owns the information, how it's controlled, and how it's stored as well. OCAP is also a course, so people can take a course in OCAP. Anyone can sign up for it. It's run through Mohawk College, and you do get a certificate in being OCAP compliant. And what I've actually seen is a lot of institutions now in Canada have OCAP compliancy actually in their institutional mandates. So for example, even here at UBC, one of the things that we're looking at is how our OER support, how our Borealis, which is our research data repository support, can become OCAP compliant. And we're even see OCAP compliancy being written into federal funding agencies and granting agencies. So this is a huge thing now, and kind of a turn in where we're looking at that sovereignty. One of the things as well is that UBC has a Indigenous strategic plan that they came out with in 2018, along the same time that the province of British Columbia agreed to support the United Declaration of, so UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Peoples, and be UNDRIP compliant within the province. Also within Canada-wide, UNDRIP is supported, but specifically, so how can UBC support UNDRIP? So out of this, they came out with the Indigenous Strategic Plan, and OCAP compliancy protocols around access to knowledges, research, things like that are part of our institutional plan. So it's Action 13 for us, talks about protocol, access to information, supporting Indigenous data sovereignty, OCAP compliancy, and how all aspects of research are formed into this, including things like OERs, and how our OER services are dealt with here at the university, and also how are our librarians trained in OCAP compliancy. So this is another thing, is that we do have supports for our staff to be able to take OCAP compliancy training and to be able to support researchers, faculty, staff, and communities members as well. We also have an initiative here at UBC called IRSI, which is the Indigenous Research Support Initiative, which kind of is an in-between between communities who are being asked to support projects like OERs, research projects, and researchers or other individuals that are creating these items. And IRSI here can also support people in their OCAP journey and becoming OCAP compliant and being able to collaborate on that. I work heavily with IRSI to also support that as well. But I would say that even looking at OCAP, and although it is its own thing, it's very specific and registered, it is something that we can look at when considering in a different context open educational resources. They also run the First Nations Data Center, which is a mitigated access to health data for communities. So when you want access to the health data, it is then communities say yes or no, and FNIGC stores it on their servers for them. One thing that I'm also interested in is how we can incorporate things like local context TK labels into OER platforms. So this is another step into asserting the rights of Indigenous folks, or acknowledging that Indigenous people have rights to their own information and their stories and their cultures in a way that's appropriate with their own protocols and self-governance systems and traditions. So what local context TK labels and licenses do is they work alongside a Creative Commons license. So often within open educational resources, we'll see some type of licensing put on them. These work alongside of them. So what the TK labels do and what the licenses do is they're two different things. So we have the traditional knowledge labels. So if you're working directly with a community and the community is creating an open educational resource, they can have these TK labels added. And so these are protocols for access to cultural heritage inside a digital context. So there's different labels that folks can use. And so right now I'm looking at how these could be used in our open collections and sit alongside a Creative Commons license. So we have different provenance labels that communities can use, and this is the thing with these that I think folks get mixed up sometimes, is the TK labels have to be given by the community directly. So this is not, I decide, oh, like this is a clan label and I put it on as a librarian. This is like the community decides this. So we have our provenance label. So this is how individuals access these items. Our protocol labels, so if it's a seasonal, men restricted, culturally sensitive, could be something, or secret, sacred. These also, if we do have information in a repository that we have to take down at any point, or that we might have to redact because it is seasonal, we can use these to explain to users why we're redacting something or why they might not be able to access it, or that the knowledges in this open educational resource are verified by the community, or it's not verified by the community. There's permission labels, which are a lot like Creative Commons licenses. And then the next thing that we have, and sorry, this is a lot of scrolling back and forth, would be like engagement notices. So for example, these are a little bit different. These are more for institutions to use. So if we're creating an OER, but we have not connected with a community yet, or we're open to engaging with communities, or we've already created an OER, which we have not engaged with a community, we can use these engagement notices to signify to the community that we want to engage with them and interact with them, and eventually have it so that they can look at the items and set their own traditional knowledge labels on it. So that is what those labels are for. There's also disclosure notices. And these are for other institutions a lot, like to be able to use and be able to use for communities who you want to engage with. And then we have also, lastly, collections care notices. So these are visible identifiers developed specifically for institutions to support proper cultural care and stewardship over collections led and guided by Indigenous protocols and authority. So they recognize and accompany cultural rights, protocols, and responsibilities that govern care. And so these are other things. So also, these were developed in collaboration with the Smithsonian National Museum of American Indian. So these are different things that we can kind of use. And I think in this stage where we're at with OER and OER development, and also thinking about considerations for OERs that might have already been created and how we can work better with communities, these are just tools that we can use to better support Indigenous peoples being able to have ownership and sovereignty over what's shared, or the way that information is being shared, right? Because there is sometimes misrepresentation of Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous worldviews in sources that need to be corrected. And this is a great way to build those partnerships with communities so that we can correct the wrongs that have been done and move forward in a responsible way. So I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint because I did want to kind of follow up on a few things with folks and get a conversation going, or be able to talk about, you know, some troubles that we might be having. So some of the kind of questions that I have is thinking about like what federal frameworks and laws can be used to support the protection of Indigenous knowledges in OERs. If you're working with community, what values need to be included in Indigenous OER principles? So if you're coming up with your own principles, you're working on a state level, a national level, on a group that's thinking about values or that can be added, or frameworks and how we develop them. Think about the tools that I just showed. So are there any other tools or resources that we can use when developing Indigenous OERs? Or in addition, what are some of the identifiable gaps or shortcomings of mentioned tools and resources regarding the development of Indigenous OERs? And I know I just shared this with y'all, but I think it's important to have this conversation. I'd like to come back kind of as a group for the last 10 minutes and have just a very open discussion as well. And I mean, if folks want to not be on camera as well, if you just want to put things in the chat, or if we wanted to stop recording very briefly, I'm okay with that as well. Oh, thank you. I'm glad that you were here today as well, and thank you for coming and for learning about this, and for being open too, because I know it can be a lot, especially for folks that don't work normally within Indigenous context. I mean, it's kind of just something that we're used to here at Huiqua because we are Indigenous librarians and we've been doing this work for quite a while. But I know for like a lot of folks that are just starting to engage in this work, it can seem like a lot and a little bit scary. And I'm always, I have colleagues that are apprehensive to do some of this work and to build these relationships because they don't want to be corrected or do things wrong. But I mean, we all get things wrong at some point. And what I always say to folks too is that if you are looking at engaging with communities, and you do get something wrong when community members they correct us, and it's okay to be corrected. It's a good thing. If you do something wrong and a community member is like, hey, you got that wrong, like you did this wrong, that's a good thing because they just want you to do better. And that's a teaching that I have, is that if you do something wrong, then that's okay.
Hi, Kayla. Thanks for coming. I saw you at OE Global actually, so it was kind of my first introduction to this thinking sort of a different way. And we don't know what we don't know, right? And
Yeah.
As a librarian, I got into to librarianship because I want all information to be available to everybody. Like that's in my course. So it's really interesting and thought-provoking for me to think, oh, my way is not necessarily the only way. So I really appreciate, thinking like that and changing those kinds of values. And I'm wondering, on a kind of personal level at my institution, how do we start talking about that? Just because I think people, we don't know what we don't know, and how do you start having those conversations with other folks at your institution, to even like spark that idea? Because I think most people are like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I want to do good. But yeah, from my point of view, how do I have those conversations? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it goes in different ways. So often it is like one individual that kind of has this heart learning moment, or that moment of aha where they're like, oh, we need to do better. And then that kind of spears like an institutional change, and where you can do like lunch and learns or have discussions, working groups around making kind of changes, looking at policies. We have like an Indigenous working group here, or the changes come because institutions themselves say we need to change. So like our ISP, everybody in the library has to work through our ISP, which includes like a very personal aspect of it, which is like how ready are you to decolonize yourself, which people can get very uncomfortable with. And then there's more the like library institutional level of it. Or sometimes we make these changes and we start having these conversations because we've been held accountable by community members to start doing that. And those are usually the times that I find like folks really panic. And that's the very like reactionary, like we need to do better because we're being held accountable. So for example, like if we put something online in our digital collections and community members are like, why did you put that online? Then it's that fast reaction to like pull things back, but then talk about it and be like, okay, so how can we do better so that we don't do that again? So I think in this case, with you even be like, hey, we need to start having these conversations and opening up these conversations with colleagues that are because not everybody will be into having these conversations. I mean, even here at UBC, like with our ISP and that we all have to do it, not everybody's on the same page. I understand that, and it stems from many different places here, politics, upbringing, everything. But having those conversations, or starting to have those conversations with colleagues that are good allies and that also are like, can help to make institutional change, I think is important. And that's even what we do here at the branch. Is one of us will go, hey, like, why don't we get, prior to this year, we didn't have a lot of community members actually coming into the branch. Then we were like, why is that? Well, we don't have a free community borrower card. So I pressured the university to do a free community borrower card. And also we didn't have a way of handing it out in community. So I pressured our borrower services into being able to do it. But it all kind of started on looking inwards and being like, where do we need to change? Meeting with the folks that were also like, why don't we ever have community members in here? And then making those pushes and having those conversations with the university. And there always is pushback, but I think starting small and then moving outward can be a really big change. or it's that reactionary change where you kind of have to do it because you're being held accountable by somebody, which is also a good thing. I think we have communities hold us accountable to our actions all the time now, which is a little bit scary, but it is, I think it's really showing the university where they've gone wrong in the last 100+ years that we've been here as UBC. Does anyone else have any questions or any kind of like comments or thinking about how they want to move forward? And the question doesn't have to be about OERs either. If you just want to ask me anything, you can feel free to do that. Pretty open to talking about things with folks.
I love the TK labels. I
Mm,
wasn't real familiar with those and thinking about ways to use them,
yeah.
you
Yeah.
know. Um,
I had a PhD student in here yesterday that's was asking about how, so we have an open collections, it's called Circle, and that's where we store mandated to store all of our theses that come out of UBC, but they are working very closely with their community and was wondering how we could use TK labels within our open collections, which is something that we haven't really explored very far. But again, it's something that is important as more and more folks are working with their communities and also within like our open collections, as in so working with our OER librarian, working with our data services, digital initiatives on how we can incorporate those, because we can upload Creative Commons licenses. So why couldn't we use those as well, right? Like I see it as a very low barrier thing or a low issue thing to be adding, which could do a lot of good for the university as well. Yes.
Hi.
Hello.
Yes, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very informative. I did not know there were Indigenous librarians and that you focused on the cultural part of your history, which is very impressive. I also had a question about some of the things you mentioned, the two ways that we can work with the community, which is consulting with them and also letting them take the lead. We're part of the Open Textbooks for Rural Arizona grant project, and we're looking at ways we can create new open educational resources, but I had not thought personally about how working with the community can be getting them involved, because we work with faculty and having faculty develop theirs, but it would be interesting maybe to take it to the community and see if that can be worked into this. My thoughts are, as an instructional designer, is looking for images and media, multimedia. Those are the things that we are having a hard time finding of the Native American Indigenous cultures that we can use. So how do you see that working, and what would be the best way to get started with that, developing that type of project where we develop open educational resources on multimedia?
Yeah, so thinking about multimedia, this one can be sometimes a little bit tricky too, because sometimes, especially if you're looking at like historic images and copyright, often copyright is with the photographer of those images, right? And sometimes there wasn't necessarily consent from individuals to take those photos. So what we do specifically when we're looking at kind of portraying images, especially within an open context, if we can, we work closely with any type of Indigenous services that we have here at like the university. So most folks come to us at Kweekwa, or we go over to MOA, which has cultural experts, and MOA is the Museum of Anthropology. So if you don't have a relationship with communities directly, reaching out to other individuals who might have those relationships with communities to kind of start that conversation going about using images or finding images that would be appropriate. The other thing that you could do if you wanted to take it a step further and reach out to communities, if you're looking at portraying images of like reserves, bands, things like that, reaching out to local band councils, so for here it would be like chief and councils, band administrations. Sometimes they have their own cultural departments within it, and then reaching out to them to see if they would even contribute photographs that they might have within their own collections and working a relationship in that way. So I think it's just depending on the relationships that you already have and how far you want to take a new relationship. And every community is different in their capacity to take on these projects. So some communities are really, really wanting to work on projects and contribute as collaborators, whereas others don't have the capacity. And so that's when we can kind of fall back on other individuals who might be able to help us in knowing what we can show and what we can't show.
Thank you. That was helpful. And that's what we're finding. It's so particular and context matters. And so we're just trying to figure out a way where we can bring together everyone to talk about how we can develop those images or videos or whatever we can develop. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I'm sorry to interrupt at this point, but this is a great conversation, but it looks like we are at time, and we do need to bounce off to the next one because the next session is linked in this Zoom. So what I could ask, please, is if you have questions, please post them quickly to the chat or send them to one of us, and we can forward them on to Kayla if that would work.
I also just put my email in the chat too. So feel free to email me as well.